Regarding Men, Episode 44, 30th Anniversary of the Montreal Massacre.
Well, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Here we are regarding men. We're discussing the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre. My name's Janice Fiamengo. I'm the host of the Fiamengo File and No Joke Janice, and I am joined by the invincible Tom Golden, author of Men Are Good.
Indeed they
And
are.
I'm also joined by the unsurpassable and the unbeatable Paul Elam, of A Voice for Men and an Ear for Men.
He liked that one.
We are. So we're discussing a serious issue today. Every year for the past 30 years, vigils are held all across Canada. They may even be held in some places in the United States, I'm not sure. Probably in every Canadian university and college on December the 6th. Mostly women gather to commemorate women slain by a mass murderer. And this is a day that is called, let me get the day right, it's called the National Day. It's actually being instituted by the Canadian government, a National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. The origins of this day are that on December the 6th, 1989, a 25-year-old man named Marc Lepine walked into the École Polytechnique, which is part of the Université de Montréal in Montreal, and he ordered that he walked into a university classroom at the engineering school, and he ordered that the men leave the class and the women stay behind. Men filed out, a woman started to protest, and he opened fire. And that day he murdered 14 women and injured, I think maybe 14 others, yes, and then committed suicide. So this was a fairly singular event in Canadian history. He left a suicide note in which he made it clear that he killed women because he had a specific grievance against feminists. He said that feminists had ruined his life, and so he was lashing back at feminists. And the event was quite quickly politically taken over by ideologues. It was used as a symbol for male violence against women. The day now is a commemoration of specifically violence against women. Vigils that are held always speak about the normalized violence that women experience every day in their lives in Canada and throughout the world. So it's become highly politicized. And it resulted in a government report called The War on Women that was published in 1991. And it was really the catalyst, I think it's fair to say, for a lot of feminist activism, especially in the legal sphere, as feminists attempted to really rewrite every law that has anything to do with male-female relations, on the books in Canada. And so it's a terrible day in which a tidal wave of anger and hatred of all men is unleashed, and that anger and that blaming of all men as responsible for violence against women has been given government sanction. All flags fly at half-mast on all federal buildings in Canada, something that apparently isn't even done on November 11th, which is Remembrance Day for our war dead. And so it has a higher status than nearly any other similar holiday, than any other similar holiday of its sort in Canada. It's a shocking event that might have been cause for honest conversation about the problems in Canadian society, specifically the polarization of men and women. A day that might have inaugurated serious discussion about mental illness, about what's happening to young men, about why a young man might feel that feminists were a profound threat in his life, why he might feel that feminism had ruined his life, as he said in his suicide note. Of course, all that was not allowed to happen, and instead it became a day to talk about male power, the power dynamic, male privilege, and supposedly the sense of entitlement that men have over women that enables them to enact this kind of violence.
It's also a day to immortalize Mark Lepine, too.
Yes.
This is what they've done. Is
Mm-hmm.
they've immortalized him. You know, one of the trends we're seeing now, finally, with these crazy mass shooters, is that the news outlets are mentioning their names less, and there's a reason for that. But what we see now is going to motivate somebody else to that kind of action. And as you just inferred, Janice, I think we should be able to say the unspeakable here. Feminism has done a lot of awful shit to a lot of men. And when you have less stable people on the periphery of society, on the margins of mental health, and you abuse them, sometimes this is what you get. Most mass shooters we know have a history of being bullied. I wondered if he did too.
Oh boy, he had a history of more than just being bullied. I mean, the guy's history was just a mile long. And this is what really pisses me off about this, is that they've taken this event and turned it into something where men are bashed as a group. I mean, toxic masculinity, toxic men beating women, but it's not about that at all. This was a kid who had severe trauma. In fact, the latest research, and research for a while now, has pointed out very clearly that mass shooters, almost every one of them, had significant childhood trauma. Significant childhood trauma, and Lepine is no exception. I mean, the guy's father beat him. The father was also abused as a child. Lepine watched his father beat his mother. And you could go on and on about the trauma that this young man had in his life. This was not your typical young man in any sense of the word. I counted them up, and I counted, I think, 6 aces out of the aces score. And it probably more. I mean, it's probably more because there was.
Explain for everybody what ACEs is, Tom.
Yeah, ACEs is oh gosh, Paul, what's it called? Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey or something like that. Yeah. It's a survey that was started years ago, that they took 10 questions about your childhood, and they started realizing, holy crap, the higher you score in this, the more this happens, the more this happens, the more this happens. And it's a fascinating thing to watch. But it basically is an index for your amount of pathology. Because the more ACEs you have, the more likely you're going to be having trouble in your life. If you've got more than 5 ACEs, you probably need to be in therapy. If you've got more than 6 or 7, you're in deep trouble. Most people, I think, I think it's 75 or 80% of people have 0 or 1 ACEs. 1 or 2 of these things happened to them when they were young. But Lepine had 6 or 7, maybe 8. And this was a young man who was very, very pathological. The poor kid, I mean, no one liked him. No one liked him in his school, right? There were a couple of girls who would befriend him. In fact, he had more friends who were girls than he had friends who were guys, which, think about that for a while. But they told the story about he got this job in a hospital, and he was scrubbing the floors or serving food for in a cafeteria, and the kids in the cafeteria didn't want him to serve them because he had his acne, right? They talked about him. They said he would tell jokes all the time, and no one would laugh. I mean, think about it. This is a kid who had severe trouble, who was obviously beaten to a pulp, and had 0 esteem. And what do you get? You get a culture that already hates men, who are going to advantage everybody else but him. And some of these people who have this kind of crap are going to blow. It's like the Joker movie. The Joker movie, what was the quote? What was that quote? He said, if you treat me in such a way that's so nasty. And here I am mentally ill. You treat me like that. You get what you deserve. And that keeps coming back in my brain when I think about this kind of thing. I mean, in some ways, our culture is getting what we deserve. You know, we have really just completely hated men and boys for such a long time. It's mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing.
And the way you see that expressed, particularly in the feminist community, is all this outrage about men and all this concern about toxic masculinity. But the moment you start talking about the things that happen to men that shape them into those kind of human beings, everybody quits listening. Nobody wants to hear another word about that. We just need to hear men are bad. That's all we need to hear.
Yes.
And when we hear that, we can move on with the problem. It's men. It's absolute insanity, and it's costing lives.
Yes.
Because we're breeding killers this
Yes.
way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're taking people who are severely disadvantaged and treating them like crap, you know, and basically pushing them away. And he felt pushed away by everybody.
See more of this. I mean,
Yes, exactly, Paul.
Treatment of men these days, with the millions of fathers go through in family courts, and the fact that it's not like Chicago everywhere over that is surprising to me.
Yes,
Yeah.
it surprises me too.
I had someone write me yesterday actually and said exactly that the surprise to him, he's in his late 30s. He feels that in the last 20 years, he's received nothing but hatred from the society at large. He feels like as a heterosexual white man, he's regarded as the epitome of hatefulness and evil. He represents everything that's wrong in society. And, you know, he said the surprise is not that more men aren't pathologically bitter, angry, and vengeful. No, sorry, I messed that up. The surprise is not that some men are, but that more men aren't.
Right.
And, you know, and that's the thing about the Le Pen story too, is that it's always said that he had a deep hatred for women. If you read the suicide note that he left and you investigate what we know about his life, of course, we don't really know what was going on in his mind, but it isn't the case. He doesn't seem to have hated women.
No.
He said that he hated feminists.
Yes.
And
he was clear about that. He told the
yeah.
class before he shot people, "You're a feminist and I hate you."
Yeah, he didn't
say you're women and I hate you. He said you're
No.
feminist and I hate you.
Yeah, and so I mean that the question to be asked is there something that feminism has done to a man like Le Pen that would give him cause? Of course, that's not to justify what he did. We're not trying to say that or anything like that, of course. But he felt...
Yes, for the cherry pickers out there.
Yes. he felt that you know, his life had been made immeasurably more difficult than it already was. I mean, he was angry at his father. He changed his name because he didn't want to have his father's name. His birth name was Gamil Garbi, and he changed his name to Mark Le Pen, possibly also because he was teased about being Arab by his classmates when he was young. But probably it most significantly seems to have been a rejection of his father, who was violent and who abandoned the family when he was very young, and Mark wanted nothing to do with his father. So, you know, he had that. He had a whole bunch of anger at male figures, a very conflicted relationship with his own masculinity, you know, as the son of a mother who had been beaten, who now was working. He didn't see his mother very much. He felt like a failure in many ways, both in relation to her and the family and in relation to society at large. He had all sorts of demons. The fact is that he couldn't help but recognize that some of the few things that he wanted to do, which had to do actually with trying to establish his masculine identity, it seems. He tried to join the military at one point, I think when he was 22, a few years before, and the military rejected him.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then not your average guy.
Right.
Something was wrong. They said it was because of antisocial stuff.
Yes. So he
already,
his
masculinity.
Yeah. It wasn't because of toxic masculinity.
Because if he had been a real man, like most real men, he would have had the good taste to kill himself instead of killing other people, like so many other men do.
Yes. And so this idea that he was somehow privileged, that he was acting out of a sense of power and entitlement, that couldn't be more wrong.
Exactly.
And he tried to get into the engineering school, and this is something that's never been explored. I think I read in Wikipedia or somewhere that he was rejected because he lacked two compulsory courses in order to be accepted. But he felt that it was because there was a feminist affiliated drive to bring in more female students into the engineering school. This is undoubtedly true. Yes. Not that that's the reason he was rejected, but that was going on in the late 80s. It's still going on today. So it's been going on for over 30 years. Now, is a man who feels that because of his biological sex, that he is prevented from entering various spheres of endeavor because of that, is he justified in feeling that he's been badly served by feminist ideology? Yes, he is.
Yes, and it's even worse than that.
We all are.
It's a not unreasonable response to feel that he has been unjustly treated by his society, prevented from making his mark in the world, doing things that might have fulfilled him merely because he happened to be born male.
There was a woman that was in one of his classes who was his lab partner, and there's interesting stories about he and this woman, but they, after a stormy start, they sort of befriended each other, and he helped her with her homework that had to do with the engineering stuff. They both apparently applied to this school, and he was tutoring her on how to do this. He knew he was smarter than she was. She got in, and he didn't. I think that was a part of what pissed him off.
And of course, again, nobody's justifying anything, but one of the worst things about the way that our society handles these matters is that we choke off so many avenues of discussion with correctness. That is absolutely insane.
Yes.
We need to talk. If you want to talk about young men murdering people, well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at a TV and figure out that's a problem sometimes. How do you want to approach it? You want to go after and just humiliate and condescend to and put down these already disaffected people, make them subject to class hatred, and then say, oh my God, somebody went over the edge.
Here's that quote I was talking about from the Joker. What do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and treats him like trash? I'll tell you what you get. You get what you fucking deserve. Interesting, eh? Because that's, he was a mentally ill loner, and society treated him like trash.
That is eerily reminiscent. I'm dating myself here, but many years ago they made a movie, Helter Skelter, where Steve Railsback played Manson.
Yeah.
And there was a moment in the courtroom where this is the exact sentiment. He said he found these children eating out of dumpsters. They had been like teenagers kicked out of their home for being pregnant or for being wild or whatever. And he took them in and gave them a home and fed them. And then they acted out their rage. And he said, you got what you deserve. In those exact words. And this society, I agree. It does. We get the politics we deserve. We get a lot that we deserve as a society.
And more is on the way.
Yep.
We've just set ourselves up terribly.
And the idea that every man on December 6th has to brace himself for a barrage of propaganda about how he has to feel bad about being male, and that the only way that he can exonerate himself from the collective guilt that he is to carry around on his shoulders is to identify against himself as a male feminist, as somebody who rejects supposedly his privilege and his power and his toxic masculinity, etc. And that is not an identity that can do very much good for him. And so feminists have created this perfect storm where men can't help but recognize that in all sorts of ways, yes, they are threatened by feminism's agenda.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's nothing wrong with recognizing that the distinctive contributions that men had traditionally made to society, in the professions, in the kind of work they did, in the masculine roles that they had, those are all being chipped away at, or either we're either told that they're no good, or men are forced to vacate those in favor of women. And that, of course,
And the only suitable response to that is for men to object vociferously and aggressively.
And yet when they do, when they do object, they're told that they're misogynist, they're a danger, there's something shameful in their objection, that they've got a mental problem, etc. So the only options are to identify against themselves as sort of anti-male men, or to have no identity at all and to simply accept that that's the way it is.
Or for men to realize that they are most vulnerable to being controlled by shame and to resist that.
Yes. And that's the bottom line.
I've been called a misogynist for 10 years. Fuck them. I don't care.
And the purpose is to get you to apologize. That's, if you look at all the brainwashing material, that's the point, is they tear up your identity until you get to the point where you have to apologize. And as soon as you apologize, they got you.
Yeah. And that's why I encourage men never.
Because you're apologizing for who you are. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And you know it's wrong. So, you know it's wrong. And that's the thing about propaganda too, is it isn't necessarily, I mean, it does sometimes work that it convinces you to believe things that aren't true.
Right.
But sometimes it also simply forces you to say things that you know are not true, or at least to acquiesce in things that you know are not true.
Yes.
And that is, there's something horrible. There's something really soul destroying about having to acquiesce in lies. You know they aren't true, but you know that if you speak out against them, you will be persecuted in some way, or shamed, or ostracized. So you go along.
And the soul destruction happens whether you rationalize your way into it or not. I mean, a lot of men just say, I'm doing what I got to do. And slowly their soul dies, even though they feel justified on one level in doing it. It's going to get to you. The life of that.
Yes.
Yeah. And
once you start apologizing, it just basically erodes your identity.
And it's so, it is so unjust too, just to go back, to this idea that Canada has a National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. You know what, the message that sends, violence against women, sometimes of course it's male violence against women, as if women who are killed by women, their deaths don't matter. But the idea that why is violence against women so much more significant and worthy of attention than violence against men? I mean, you guys, I feel silly even saying that, because this is something we've talked about so often, and I know you're so well aware of it, but it's just, I don't know, the skewing of reality is so deep and pervasive and so outrageous.
Yes.
And unfortunately, as long as men value sexual access to women more than they do their own dignity, this will continue.
It's sad, but true.
Yeah, it's so. I remember reading, I think it's there's a wonderful chapter, if anybody wants to read it, in Paul Nathanson and Catherine Young's marvelous book called Legalizing Misandry. And they have a whole chapter on the Montreal Massacre. There it is. There it is. Such
I read that chapter today, or parts of it.
What a tome. It's the last word really on the subject of how the hatred of men, the suspicion of men has actually been put right there into law. It's just an amazing book.
It is amazing.
And they talk about the fact that just a few years before the Montreal Massacre, there was a hostage taking in Lebanon, a TWA flight, where, and this happens often in hostage situations, where the women and children are allowed to leave the situation and the men remain behind. Nobody ever, that just passes
Well, wait a minute, Janice.
unremarked.
Didn't those women protest? Didn't they
Yeah,
try and take the
exactly.
gun away from that guy?
Yeah, exactly. And that is
No.
simply accepted as a little tiny shred of decency in an otherwise horrific situation. Nobody talks about that as representative of the special valuing of women in societies across the world.
Right.
And yet this thing happened, and it becomes the definitive, even though it was this very singular act, nothing like it has happened in the 30 years since then, but it becomes the definitive representative moment that shows that somehow, women are badly treated in Canadian society and throughout the world, and, men are somehow privileged. It's so unfair in every way and so wrong.
Yes. Gynocentrism.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Always the happy conclusions.
Yeah.
This is so upbeat. This just like makes my day every day.
We'll find something to laugh about next time. But
God.
yeah, it really is, to me, it really is a missed opportunity, we could have had. It could have turned into a national conversation, yes, including women's issues, because 14 women did die, and that is a terrible, terrible thing.
Yes.
The
and
question is that a women's issue?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Why is that? Yeah. What about the numbers of men who die violently? We know that it's...
And the thing is, this is a still, when you look at it with his history, everything's there. This guy was three kinds of crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It was a mental health issue.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
No doubt about it. And a child abuse issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is not a women's issue. They happen to be the victims, but it's not like men aren't victims of this stuff either.
Exactly.
In the big picture, this is a child abuse and mental health issue, and we live in a society that is too freaking stupid to even talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just, such a shame. Yeah.
I was thinking today, what a different world we would live in if the original feminists had really come to the table in trying to negotiate with men about what would be the right thing for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, it was hard to think about, really, because it's just so unthinkable. And of course, the feminists go, we couldn't do that because, we had to blah, blah, blah. But still, just think about it. I mean, what would it have been like if we could have really negotiated, men and women, in good faith and loving good faith? How do we work things out? How can we do this domestic violence thing so that both men and women are cared for?
But feminism never had the goal of partnering with men, everything. All this idea of bullshit equality that feminists talking about, if it had been in order to partner with men on governing the planet and our worlds and our society, that would have been awesome.
Exactly.
It would have been absolutely awesome.
Exactly.
I agree. Disagree with me, but I think it would have been great.
Yep.
But their intention was to run away and depart from men from the beginning, and to promote divorce and
project their shadow onto men.
So, and part of the result of that, I think, is people like Le Pen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can't disagree with that.
Yeah.
That's a society he was raised in, and of course, we don't want to talk about that either.
Mm-hmm. No. And I think, that is part of the reason why, and we are hoping to discuss the film Joker pretty soon. We're a little bit behind the rest of society, maybe next time.
Friday.
And, and that I think is a big part of the reason why that film generated so much anger.
Exactly.
The concerted fury. Why? It's not a men's rights film. I went thinking that it was going to be, like a fictional version of The Red Pill or something. It is not at all. But it's a film that actually looks with empathy at mental illness and societal neglect. I think even like 20 years ago, it would have been a film that a lot of people on the feminist left would have been able to get behind. In many ways, it's about, disempowered people
Yes.
and how they
yes.
hurt and how they get pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And finally, some of them snap because
Yep.
of the cruelty of the world, the ugliness and cruelty of the society that we've all created together. It doesn't blame anybody in particular. And yet because the victim of that is a white man with a mental illness,
Right.
that is not acceptable. He can only be framed within that framework of white male privilege.
And they're afraid of all of us white guys getting triggered by this film. If I
Yeah.
go see that, I may have to,
Start
come
killing
out with
people.
guns in my hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. It's just amazing that the refusal of empathy on the part of the wider feminist society when it happens to be a white man who is the one who's suffering. And that was the case of Mark Dupin. He had no power. He was not a privileged man. He had no sense of entitlement. Those were all the last things that he had. And yet somehow he has to be slotted into that narrative.
It's sort of like the commemoration of Le Pen every year has become like the reefer madness of feminism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, anyway, we'll let it go there.
Are we finished?
Yeah. And
think
let's
so.
say to all the
Putas
men out there,
and-
let's refuse the sense of collective shame and collective responsibility for wrongdoing.
Yes.
that December 6th has become all about.
And at the same time, maintain compassion for those who were killed. I mean, you don't want to lose that, but don't let it become
terrible tragedy.
I mean, what they've done is leverage this in order to get what they want
For
politically.
that reason,
which is disgusting.
I'm happy to nominate Le Pen for the Puta.
Oh, for the Buddha?
Fine.
Yeah.
He gets it. Society shares it with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, who gets the humanitarian?
We didn't come up with one this week.
Yeah, I don't think there can be.
Maybe we'll
Wasn't
skip
meant
it.
to be.
I don't think there can
We'll
be.
skip it this week.
No.
Yeah, it's not
Oh,
that kind
God.
of, not that kind
On
of
that
week.
happy note.
On that happy note.
And thank you guys for all the feedback and support and everything for what we're doing. We really appreciate it.
Yes, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. So are we finished?
Yeah, I think we are. Okay. Until
night.
next week.
All right, y'all take care. Maybe
Okay,
Joker
take
next week.
care.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.